American culture. It is week 12. Today is Friday. This is our second lecture of the week, but as you know, we had a quiz today, so we're doing the next section, which is chapter 6. And this lecture, along with the one I do over the weekend, will be the material for quiz number 6. The quiz today was well done. 54 students took it. So, 10 people are still not showing up. A couple students told me beforehand that they wouldn't be able to write it, and you can be excused. As I said, don't worry about it if you have a set schedule, military service, personal thing, illness. You have to contact the English department and you have to document your absence, and then that quiz will not count. You don't get 0, it just disappears from your record, okay? That's how it works. So there was 2 students today that were excused for legitimate reasons. If you sleep in, you don't hand in the quiz on time, or any of other, decisions or mistakes, I can't do anything about that. The quiz scores were very high, not surprising, because I feel like this one was a little bit, I gave you a couple softball questions. There was a pretty thorough explanation of all the material. This is quiz number 5, so you've had lots of practice, and the questions were not particularly difficult. I suspect that a couple of people used their book or searched on the internet because the questions were too simple. But anyway, well done. There was the average score was 8 this time. There were very few students who got, low grades like 1s, 2s, and 3s, which means people are not guessing, which I'm happy with. If you look it up, hopefully at least you'll, remember enough so that you can use it on the exam. Of course, our exam is going to be in person in this building, okay? Final exam, you have to come here. Now, some students have already asked me, when is the exam going to be? And I don't know. I asked this week. Today I asked again, and they responded that next week they will start scheduling the exam. So you have to be patient. I know you have to figure out a place to stay. It's more complicated than usual because some people are in their hometowns. You have to find a place to stay for a couple weeks. Dormitory, okay, I know that, but I don't know until next week. I can't tell you. So I'll try and figure it out on Monday, and I'll post it as a notification on the cyber campus as soon as I know, and I've got confirmation of the room and the time. I will tell you, okay? Now, I'm using my old book today. This is okay because in chapter 6 it's largely the same, but basically I forgot my new book at home, so I'm using the 2nd edition instead of the 3rd edition. But as you know from my answers and my explanation, I'm always using the 3rd edition to teach. I'm just reminding myself of the content with the blue book today, but there is about 5,000 words and some things that are just not in the blue book. So some of you I know, because they tell me, when the books are sold. Some students bought the older book, probably because it's 15,001 instead of 16,000 and you wanted to save 1,001. But it's not a great idea because it's a different book. It's been updated, so be aware that there's no stuff about Isaac Newton or Charles Dickens or Mark Twain, or a few other things scattered throughout the textbook. They're not there. So I hope you pay attention to the lecture about those things because they're not in the 2nd edition, okay? We need to talk about, basically we're going to talk about expansion today, okay? North America has now become Spanish in the south, American in the middle, and British North America in the north, which will turn into Canada halfway through the centuries. So I am Canadian, so I'm briefly going to just say something important about Canada. When the American Revolutionary War occurred, there were people on both sides. Not everyone wanted to separate, and the British were actually hoping that there were enough people in the colonies that wanted to remain British that it would, support them and tilt the public opinion in their favor. They were wrong, but there were still thousands and thousands of them that didn't really want the Sons of Liberty, George Washington, the Continental Congress, and the New Republic running things. They still wanted to be British. We call these people loyalists, okay? And these loyalists, they were discriminated against. They were considered traitors, right? That had helped the British and supported them, and they had lost. So after the revolution was over and the Republic was established, the United States of America became a country, these people found it hard to coexist. It wasn't really violent per se. It's just when it came to society and positions and relations with their neighbors, it was uncomfortable, and they wanted to be part of the British Empire still. And conveniently, there was this huge territory. Like I said, at the time it was British North America. It becomes Upper Canada and Lower Canada. Confusingly on the map, it looks like Ontario is lower than Quebec, but Lower Canada is Quebec because it's the ocean. It's closer, it's lower. And Ontario is where Toronto and where the majority of Canadians live now. So Toronto is a city that develops. Hamilton, Ontario, and Southern Ontario, Upper Canada, basically gets a huge influx of loyalist Americans that they don't want to be American, they want to remain British citizens. So they move to Upper Canada, and this creates a balance in Canada between the French population and the English population. Because before the French lost, it was all French people. Then slowly British people were trickling in, so the majority of the population was French. After the American Revolutionary War, over the 20 years that followed, 1780s, there were a lot of people that relocated from the colonies to Canada. And the immigration back and forth continued over the last several hundred years. But the initial immigration flow was out of America. So there was all these Anglo-American families that resettled in Southern Ontario. And there's a monument near my university of a Loyalist family in a statue of a Loyalist family who, downtown Hamilton, Ontario, who had relocated and, built up the cities and the infrastructure and increased the population of Canada. So then you have gradually the English population growing and growing until it overtakes the French population. But anyway, there's more of a balance between the population of French Canadians and English Canadians. There's now Quebec has maintained its culture and it's a unique part of Canada, which we're very proud of. And most of Canadian history, especially until the last 200 years, is mostly related to French Canadian history. So that's the story. And in a way, there are two countries created by the American Revolutionary War. The United States of America is created, and as a result, the country of Canada, the creation of America eventually puts enough pressure on British North America that they turn it into the Dominion of Canada. And that's what it's talking about in the British North America Act of 1867. That is celebrated as the beginning of Canada. That's our Confederation Day. Canada Day is July 1st. American Independence Day is July 4th. Canadian Confederation Day is July 1st. That's called Canada Day now. There's the National Anthem there in Canada in French and English, And then one of them is official French, and then there's the translation from French because it's a different version. And there's the Canadian flag, which was adopted not that long ago. It's The Canadian flag is much more recent. We used to have a flag that looks kind of like the Australian flag, with a Union Jack in the corner and a red background. But we got rid of that and we chose to adopt the maple leaf in 1965. That's it for Canada. Thank you for appearing. We'll probably mention them when we talk about railroads. But for now, America is building a country, right? They've got their independence, but they need to find a way to consolidate their identity, okay? So I mentioned those 6 different things that you're going to work on in your assignment. Continue to keep those things in mind: freedom, education, right? Pride, those things that I mentioned already. But add to it specific things as we go. For the next 3 weeks, not even, 2.5 weeks, there's 4 lectures left, plus the exam review. I'm going to do my best to cover the development of the American identity and culture. So one of the things that's different about British culture is, British culture, once they created British culture in 1707, it became the United Kingdom. They had the Kingdom of Scotland, which was 1,000 years old, and the Kingdom of England, which was over 1,000 years old. And then they could go back even farther, to the 7 kingdoms. They could go back even farther to Romano Britain. And if they really wanted, they go all the way back to Celtic Britain and talk about the Britons in the pre-Roman era. Much more difficult for America to do that because the people that occupied there were not the same people. They did start to incorporate, stories, native stories and images. We'll talk about the native people and how important they are in the next lecture. But it's a different thing. It's an appropriation, and it's not as easy. It's not like the Normans, and the Anglo-Saxons saying, "Oh, Arthur was a mythological king who defended Romano Britain against us, right? Against the Anglo-Saxons. But we're gonna borrow him because he is also European and looked kind of similar to us, and his culture and his language and everything are connected." But when you see a picture of a native person in America with their clothing and their appearance and their language and their distinctiveness and their worldview, it's much harder for an American to say, well, that's our history too. But they do it. They do it gradually. Benjamin Franklin went, when all these mountain men and outdoorsmen and explorers, John Smith is famous, because of his contact with the natives, they imitated them. The natives became more Western and European, and the Europeans became more like, especially the ones that were on the frontier, the way that they survived was by learning and copying natives all the time. And they admired them. They were afraid of them. They admired them. But we'll talk again. Get back to the natives after we deal with all of the other stuff. So, tall tales and folklore are a way, just like the Arthur myth and Robin Hood, which we talked about briefly. They are ways of, raising your children and saying, these are examples of American values. And this is what it means to be an American. If you want to be a real American, you want to be like Paul Bunyan, or you want to be like Davy Crockett. You want to be tough and strong and brave and independent and capable and, fearless and admired and impressive. They have these, symbols of strength and vitality and size that are kind of recurrent in the stories. Some of them are meant to just explain, like there's different purposes of myths, right? To unify people, give explanations for things, to entertain. There's various reasons why you tell myths, and it's something that all cultures share. Mythologizing continues, throughout history, and it often some of the, origins of a place get explained. Paul Bunyan's a great example because his story is so interesting. Now, I'm going to link some examples for you to read and check out. I encourage you to do it, but it's kind of supplementary stuff. I'm not going to ask you, specific things about Paul Bunyan, but I want you to know the story, and I want you to know about Davy Crockett too. So those are both in the textbook. The particular things about Davy Crockett and Paul Bunyan that are distinctive. Paul Bunyan is actually a real, like, legendary, exaggerated character. It's a tall tale because he is literally so tall that he can knock over whole trees with his axe, and he can split mountains in half, and he can carve a companion ox out of granite or pieces of stone. And when he gets tired, he drags his axe, and the axe splits the desert in half and creates the Grand Canyon. There's all these things like this. Explains how the country was formed. That is obviously not part of the native tradition at all. There are native myths explaining how things were developed as well, but a tall tale is one that's not real, and it's exaggerated. It's not supposed to be realistic in any way. So everything about that tale is tall, big, huge, unlikely, or impossible. In contrast, there was a real life hero named Davy Crockett, who was an avid outdoorsman. He was a hunter. He supposedly wrestled grizzly bears. That's not true. He was a soldier and a politician, and he was a very kind of idealized American hero. And he died fighting in the Alamo, fighting the Mexicans in the American-Mexican War. So you have to read up on that a little bit too. Okay, now we've talked about slavery. We didn't talk about it in as much detail as I would like to, but I told you the basic principles of how horrible it was. And for a number of reasons, part of America, the southern part, not South America, be careful there because South America is a different continent, but the South, especially the deep South, the five countries, they're not countries, they probably would have liked to have been countries, but the 5 states, across Alabama, Georgia, can't remember them all, Missouri, Mississippi, there's 5, and they're called the Deep South, which is especially the culture of the American South. But Georgia and Virginia, South Carolina, North Carolina, those are southern states too. All of these states together form the slave states, the states that refused to free their slaves, that they were against emancipation, which is a fancy word for freeing slaves, abolishing slavery. You hear these words all the time in American history: emancipation and abolish. Abolish means remove completely, and emancipation means give something its freedom. So the Emancipation Proclamation is when Abraham Lincoln declares the slaves to be free. And the people who want slavery, before that happens and the Civil War occurs, the people who want slavery to go away, to make it illegal, they're called abolitionists. Okay? Now the thing you have to understand is although the majority of the people in the northern states were anti-slavery in principle, they were still racist. And especially by our standards, remember, this is 200 years ago, so you got to remember, you have to kind of measure them a little bit differently. But if a lot of the people that wanted slaves to be free or just wanted to ignore the problem had racist perspectives, right? They didn't want the black people to be slaves, but they didn't want them to be free in their country either. So one of the solutions that Abraham Lincoln even tried, and the government tried, which failed, was to try and return freed African Americans to Africa. First of all, they didn't prepare anything properly, so this caused people to suffer and die. So first reason a black American would not want to do that is because there was a good chance they would die going back to Africa or going to an island somewhere where they didn't have land or resources or a country or society or any kind of support, that it would be like recolonizing Africa in reverse. This was not very well thought out, and they dropped the plan because it was a disaster. But more important than that, the African Americans who had endured several hundred years of slavery, right? Because we're talking 1619 all the way up to the 1860s. So 250 years of slavery, some of them. It doesn't really matter though. Some of them have been there for generations though. And they've been relocated and they've adapted and they've, worked to build the country. And then they're going to free them, then send them back to a place that they don't know. They've never lived. Maybe they don't speak the language or have anything in common with anybody in West Africa. So they don't want to go back. They think they belong in America, and they do. And they've worked at least as hard as anybody else, if not harder, under worse conditions, and they don't want to go. So the African Americans reject this concept of freedom, but leave our country, and they are the ones that are free, the ones that are able to get to the north. There's something called the Underground Railroad that helps people escape. Some of them go to the north, some of them go to Canada. But the reality is, Canada was not a friendly place just to Black people in general. There was still racism. There was slavery in Canada at times. It was never really, once the British Empire abolished it in the early 1800s, Canada was part of the British Empire, so slavery was illegal. But that didn't mean that you could get a job or you were treated well by your neighbors just because you were free. So there's a lot of things that the Civil War is not going to solve. Just because slavery goes away, it doesn't solve the racism problem, which is why we still have a racism problem today in the United States, as many countries do. South Africa continues to have a problem. Canada, also, there's racism there. It's particularly bad in certain places, but the war that occurs happens for a variety of reasons. It's really about political power and economic power than anything else. The South, they see what happens in South America, and they see what happens in Haiti, and they see the revolutions and the rebellions, and they're afraid that their society is going to turn upside down, and there's going to be a race war, and the Black people are going to take revenge, and they're going to murder them. There's that issue. The economy is built around King Cotton. They're producing cotton, and they need labor, and there's always a shortage of labor in America, so most of this labor comes from Africa. The South is dependent completely on African slaves. The whole society is built around their economic production, the threat of them rebelling, the political presence that they represent, because slaveholders get to vote, and they get to vote according to how many slaves they have by proxy. So it gives them political power, it gives them economic power, and it gives them security, they believe. So the plantation system, they feel like they can't give it up. And if they don't expand it, as new states are developing in the West, the new states are free states. And the slave states think that, as is true, as states are added, if free states outnumber the slave states 2-1 or 3-1, then there'll be a block of political power that will change the law. And they will not be able to protect their slave society from being reformed. And they're right about this, because eventually that's what's going to happen. So they try to compromise, but most of the northern states want the slave system to stop where it is, and the current number of slave states to remain static. But it's kind of right from the beginning. It's something a lot of people feel strongly about, but they don't want to talk about it, let alone fight about it. But this issue won't go away, and it becomes bigger and bigger until the southern states threaten to leave. And the North says you can't. And so they leave anyway. And basically it's to supposedly maintain their states' rights. And they want but the problem, they always claim it's not about slavery, it's about states' rights, that the federal government is telling us what to do. Yeah, the federal government is telling you what to do because that's what federal governments are. You're a country. A state is subordinate to the nation. That's how it works. They think they're infringing on their rights only because they all have something in common. They're right in their states. They have the right to own slaves. They have the right to own other people. And that is the fundamental problem. All their other rights are being preserved, except they're afraid of losing their right to own people. So they secede from the Union, and they say they're a new country, the Confederacy. Jefferson Davis becomes the president of the new country, and Abraham Lincoln becomes the president of the North and loses his power over the South completely. The main general on the southern side is undeniably, sorry, I've lost his name momentarily. I was going to say Lee Roberts, but his name is clearly not Lee Roberts, it's Robert E. Lee. I didn't look that up, I swear, but I briefly forgot about it. It's probably not going to mention much about him, but Ulysses S. Grant ends up being the most important general in the end, but there's a sort of, they go through quite a few different generals in the North. We're not going to talk about what happens in the war so much as just how terrible it was. You have to read about this because it takes me too long to explain. But basically, there's a lot of controversy about it. It continues. If you ask an American to describe in one word what they think of the Civil War, this is what they would say. And this is from the History Channel, history.com in America. This is what I found in the interview. This is what they offered. Freedom, American principle. Bloody, heroic, fortunate, unintended, right? Unfinished or tragic. Heroic, very positive. Tragic, negative. Unintended, accidental, like not even planned, an accident of sorts. And bloody, the disaster, so many deaths. Freedom, again, sounds like a good thing. Fortunate, well, lucky. I don't agree with that one. Fortunate because they won, I guess. Anyway, it's one of the most devastating wars. It's like the Napoleon Wars in Europe. It rips the country in half, and they fight incredibly terrible battles where tens of thousands of people die, and Napoleon loses similar amounts of men in his battles. This is modern war. Napoleon has cannons and guns and invents this, concept of total war, where they create huge armies. They draft huge numbers of soldiers and they throw them all into battle with, new kinds of guns and weapons. Same thing happens in the American Civil War. It's very, very, the numbers of people dying are off the charts. You don't see that in very many battles throughout history. And this is what modern warfare is. It's a sneak peek at what's going to happen when you have bombs and huge guns, airplanes, tanks, stuff like that. There's a lot of soldiers, a lot of weapons, and there's a lot of death. So in the end, the North succeeds in defeating the South, mostly because they have more people, they have better equipment, they have better material, they have more money, financial and economic ties, and they have sort of more international support because the Western European powerful countries are all leaning towards, anti-slavery for moralistic reasons, even though they're still imperial powers. They don't believe that people should be enslaved and their rights completely stripped from them, although they are still racist, as I said. Imperialism still is basically other people are, less valuable than us, but that doesn't mean you should treat them as possessions. That's the line. So the South the South runs out of men and morale and equipment and space. They're being attacked from all sides, and the Confederacy surrenders. Then Abraham Lincoln, of course, is assassinated, as you probably know, and the beginning of the antebellum period, the Gilded Age, begins. While this Civil War is the most important thing in the middle of the century in the 1860s, there's also westward expansion, and throughout the entire 19th century, constant war with Mexico, natives, itself. At the end of the century, they're going to fight against Spain. America is a country that's almost been at war for its entire history. Out of the entire 235 years or so of American history, very few years have been has the United States been at peace. So 90% of the time, America's at war with someone. There's only about 20 years in its entire history that it's been at peace, which is a pretty shocking thing, because it seems like they start wars and end them, but they actually start and stop them continuously. So even if it's a small war on the other side of the country, or it's a fairly minor thing compared to a world war, they're still at war with somebody, always. And it's a characteristic of American culture also, to be constantly at war. Sometimes it's more serious, and sometimes it's more reserved or more localized, but it's war. So the side effects of this westward expansion, we're going to have to talk about this next lecture. We have to talk about the infrastructure. I would like to talk about the transportation revolution. What happens when America starts to find a way to develop its interior, and when they get the territory of Texas and the Oregon Territory and California. The gold rush is in there too, and how it attracts so many people to move to the West Coast. And now California is the largest, in terms of population, is the largest, most important state in the United States. But, at the beginning of the 19th century, it wasn't even part. Los Angeles is a Spanish name, because that's where, Spanish colonists had established a presence. There's a lot of Hispanic Mexican people who live in California, and it was first colonized by the Spanish, but taken away from them. And shortly after they got control of California, gold was discovered there, and there was a huge movement of immigration, mining, and speculation. So California, the population of California exploded. That's why we have the San Francisco 49ers, 1849. So 49ers. That's my favorite NFL football team. So we're going to talk about cowboys and natives and the transportation revolution, westward expansion next time. And that'll close up chapter 6 and prepare you for quiz number 6. So sorry about that interruption there. When I couldn't remember Robert E. Lee, General Robert E. Lee's name for some reason, I've stuck on Robert and Davis. But anyway, remember those 4 names as leaders. The military leader of the South, Robert E. Lee. Jefferson Davis was the president of the Confederacy. And in the North, Abraham Lincoln, easy to remember, and Ulysses S. Grant became the overall commander of the Union forces, and he was the one who forced Robert E. Lee to surrender in 1865. Okay, so that's your introduction to the 19th century stuff. I guess the lecture on Sunday will be a pretty important one, so make sure you listen carefully. And that's it for our Friday. Please be patient. The exam schedule will be posted sometime next week, and I'll keep updating you on everything. Don't forget your assignment is due on Friday, and there's a quiz on Friday. And then after that, it's just a few more lectures and our exam. Thanks. thank you for listening, and have a good weekend.